Our speaker this evening earned his bachelor's degree from Drury College, his master's and PhD degrees from Indiana University, where he wrote his doctoral dissertation on George Nicholas, a worthy of the early national period. He has taught early American history at Ball State for 17 years and probably has presented the American Revolution several times each year. Before that, Dr. Kaldemeyer taught at Drury College and at Indiana University. It is with a particular pleasure and pride that I present Dr. Richard Kaldemeyer, who will speak on the American Revolution.
When I first took this assignment, I thought I'd better bone up a little bit on some standard works such as Lecky and Trevelyan and Alden and Gibson and Ward, to say nothing about numerous articles in scholarly journals. By the time I spent about 2 weeks, most of which was my vacation, doing that, I had somewhat the sentiments of the little boy who was an avid reader and went to the library, and he was a regular in his attendance at the library. The librarian was very much concerned about his not finding the right kind of book, since he read so voraciously. And one day she had a new book and she called his attention to it. It was on penguins. So he was looking for something and took it. A week later he came back and he returned the book, didn't say anything, and she said, "How did you like the book about the penguins?" And he shrugged his shoulders and said, "Sounded very delightful, except," told him a little bit more about penguins than he intended to know or cared to know. And having refreshed myself on the American Revolution, I'm much in the same capacity. By the time we complete this series on the subject of revolutions, many of you, as well as myself, may be thoroughly confused as to the meaning of the word revolution. Such confusion is understandable, since in common usage it has come to mean anything from a limited change achieved with little disturbance to a total change accompanied by violence and revolution. I have a hunch that by the time we finish this series, with each of us disavowing ours being a thoroughgoing revolution, that we may have been better to have entitled this series something else. Even if we could agree upon a definition of the term revolution, there would be disagreement on how and when it applied to the American scene. A public opinion poll on the subject probably would show that the term American Revolution means different things to different people. To some, it conjures up visions of a series of glorious military encounters, beginning with the famous engagement at Lexington in 1775 and ending with the surrender of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown in 1781. To others, it suggests the long struggle between the British government and the American colonies, from the Puritan Revolution in England to the recognition of American independence over 175 years later. Midway between these two extremes lie many other meanings. Agreement on definition and chronology would resolve only some of the differences of opinion arising from a study of the American Revolution. There still remains the question of interpretation. Here again, we must ask, by whom? Generally speaking, contemporary accounts of the period immediately preceding the outbreak of hostilities took the form of emotionally charged documents, sermons, newspaper accounts, and letters, which presented both the imperial and the colonial viewpoint with equal vigor. Such a war of words continued until 1776, after which time the defenders of the British viewpoint were silenced, giving free rein to the proponents of the colonial cause. Since people who were contemporary to the events of the American Revolution were naturally subjective in their interpretation, it remained for scholars with a perspective of the whole broad range of history to add the element of objectivity. Unfortunately, it was a long time before the latter was accomplished. Meanwhile, historians emphasized the heroics of the Revolution and minimized the various social, economic, and political struggles which occurred before, during, and after the war. Following the ratification of the Constitution in 1788, writers were caught in a great upsurge of nationalism, which, except for brief interludes of intense sectionalism, continued throughout the 19th century. The same historians who misrepresented the developments of the Revolutionary War era accepted the dubious slogan "Manifest Destiny" without question. When in a final surge of nationalistic endeavor near the end of the century we acquired overseas possessions, they were further encouraged to perpetuate their ultra-nationalistic cliches. Thus, for over 100 years, as a nation, our history was presented either as an uncritical echo of biased contemporary accounts or as a panegyric of nationalism. It is little wonder, then, that the history of the American Revolution was treated as an old-fashioned melodrama, complete with hero and villain. For the untrained historians of the past, to be content with such stereotyped versions of our struggle for independence was bad enough. But when a leading historian of the caliber of George Bancroft took up the cudgels of ultranationalism and applied them to his story of English tyranny versus American liberty, hopes for a fair, unbiased study of the Revolutionary era necessarily was postponed. Fortunately, such postponement was of short duration. Just before the dawn of the present century, scientific historical research began to be pursued with such fervor and enthusiasm as to suggest a determined effort to make up for lost time. An increase in the number of graduate schools, each pursuing a policy of publish or perish, has resulted in a plethora of books and articles dealing with the Revolution. As a result, the volume of these materials now is so great and the interpretations so diverse as to make it impossible to arrive at anything like complete agreement on the subject. The more we study the Revolutionary era, the more apparent it is that there were numerous and varied conflicts among the colonists themselves, conflicts which involved social, economic, and religious factors. The fact that the principal conflict was between the colonies and the mother country has tended to obscure the lesser ones on the domestic scene. F. Franklin Jameson saw the need to stress the interrelationship of all the factors of the Revolution when he wrote, quote, "All the varied activities of the men in the same country and period have intimate relations with each other. One cannot obtain a satisfactory view of one of them by considering it apart from the others," unquote. Out of this welter of interpretation and reinterpretation of American history, the date 1763 emerges as a defensible date to mark the beginning of the Revolutionary War, or the Revolution, and the date 1789 its end. Furthermore, such a period can be subdivided into three parts. One, the so-called decade of controversy. Two, the military phase of the war. And three, the military phase of the Revolution. And three, the post-war developments, which culminated in the Constitutional Convention. Recognizing that revolutions are not spontaneous affairs, we need only to mention a few developments of the pre-revolutionary period to help explain the struggle between England and her American colonies. Late in the 17th century, England and France began a series of wars to determine, among other things, who was to control North America. Prior to the commencement of these wars, England possessed that region extending from the crest of the Appalachians to the Atlantic coast, while France claimed the St. Lawrence and Mississippi River valleys. In 1713, following the War of the Spanish Succession, France ceded to England Newfoundland, Acadia, and an area around Hudson Bay. The final bid for hegemony came with the French and Indian War, at the conclusion of which France was eliminated as a colonial power in North America. During the course of the prolonged struggle between these two European giants, England pursued a policy known as salutary neglect, which Prime Minister Robert Walpole liked to refer to as a policy of letting sleeping dogs lie. While Parliament continued to pass laws regulating trade with the colonies, Walpole and his immediate successors chose to overlook violations of them. Taking advantage of this situation, the colonists blatantly ignored those laws which they did not like and conscientiously complied with those that they did like. Such a state of bliss came to an abrupt end in 1763. Following her unsuccessful bid for control of North America east of the Mississippi, the British government, faced with a huge war debt, attempted to get her colonies to pay a proportionate share of the cost of the imperial defense. To effect this change in policy, the ministry abandoned salutary neglect. This decision was not only highly unpopular among the colonists for economic reasons, but was psychologically ill-timed for other reasons. So long as the French posed a threat to the English colonists, the latter were inclined to cooperate with the British government. When this threat was removed, colonial leaders were encouraged to demand greater political autonomy. The chances for colonial acceptance of this change of policy was further lessened when in 1763 Sir George Grenville succeeded William Pitt as head of the cabinet. One of his first acts was to advise the king to issue the famous Proclamation of 1763, whereby the colonists were forbidden to go west of the crest of the Appalachians. Having deluded themselves into thinking that they were largely responsible for defeating France during the course of the intercolonial wars, the colonists were understandably resentful. Such resentment was not limited to the would-be settlers, but also to many persons of means who were interested in land speculation in the West. I might add parenthetically that the Royal Governor of Virginia, for instance, was very much interested in land speculation in the West. In failing to tell the colonial leaders that the proclamation line would be only temporary, Grenville passed up an opportunity to make an unpopular act palatable. Since the act was rarely enforced, however, its importance as an economic cause of the American Revolution can be minimized. Unfriendly to the colonial viewpoint, Grenville not only demanded stricter enforcement of the old Navigation Act, but got Parliament to pass new ones. He began with the Sugar Act of 1764, which was designed to regulate colonial trade with the foreign West Indies, as well as to raise revenue. Even though this act reduced by 50% the tax on foreign molasses coming into the English colonies, official notification of an intention to enforce it made it unacceptable to the colonists. I'd like to see a similar reduction today of about 50%. I think I could find it easy to rejoice. Equally unpopular in the colonies was the Currency Act of the same year, which forbade the issuance of paper money as legal tender in all of the colonies. They had already done it in some, but now it's extended to all. Without waiting for the furor of the Sugar Act to die down, Parliament announced its plans to pass another revenue measure to be known as the Stamp Act. giving the colonial leaders a year's time in which to propose an alternative measure did little to enhance its chances of acceptance. Instead of devising a substitute tax, the colonists took steps to organize resistance in anticipation of the act itself. A month before the Stamp Act was to become effective, delegates representing 9 colonies met to protest this latest action of Parliament. Claiming all the rights of Englishmen, these delegates challenged the right of Parliament to levy any tax on them without their consent. Since the remoteness of the colonies from England precluded representation in Parliament, and since the colonists rejected the idea of virtual representation, the chances for a meeting of the minds on the subject of taxes was slim. The chances were slim, excuse me. The Stamp Act is an example of an act which was both ill-conceived and ill-executed. In the first place, it levied a tax which was to be collected from the 2 most articulate groups in the colonies, the lawyers and the newspaper publishers. What protest one couldn't scribble, the other could blab. And I might say that when the tax was first announced, there was an inch black border around the page, so that even a moron could tell that something was wrong. Secondly, its widespread unpopularity made it difficult, if not impossible, to collect. For obvious reasons, many persons declined the lucrative post as collectors. The few who failed to perceive the obvious were frequently physically assaulted by enraged mobs. The repeal of this odious act came as a result of the non-importation agreement drawn up at the Stamp Act Congress. Responding to the bitter complaints of British merchants, who were the first to feel the effects of these agreements, Parliament repealed the act, only to enact the Declaratory Act, wherein it was asserted that Parliament retained full authority and power to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Intoxicated with their victory over the repeal of the Stamp Act, the colonists paid scant heed to a mere declaration of a right. Up to this time, the history of the British Empire, the American colonies, which had been founded during the great debate between the Crown and Parliament over the distribution of power, generally supported the claims of Parliament. In fact, they had patterned their own legislatures on the House of Commons and had consistently employed the theories of parliamentary rights in their struggle with the governors and proprietors of the colonies. But now they viewed the prerogatives of Parliament in quite a different light. The resumption of good relations between England and her American colonies after the repeal of the Stamp Act might have lasted indefinitely if King George III, who was disdainful of learning the truth about American affairs, if he had not gained control of Parliament. The political ascendancy of the king, and there is some argument as to whether or not he bribed his way into control of Parliament, coupled with the retirement of William Pitt, who was basically sympathetic to the colonial viewpoint, enabled Charles Townshend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, to vent his hostility against the colonies. First, he suspended the New York legislature when it trimmed his request for a requisition of supplies for British troops. Then he created the Board of Commissioners of Customs and used general search warrants, known as writs of assistance, to enforce the unpopular Navigation Act. Finally, he engineered the passage of an act which bears his name and which imposed duties on lead, paper, paints, glass, and tea. Taking advantage of the acknowledgement of the colonists that Parliament had the right to levy duties so long as they were not for the purpose of internal revenue, he stated in the preamble that the tax to be collected was strictly an external tax, even though its primary intent was for revenue instead of regulation. To add insult to injury, the act stipulated that the revenue so obtained might be used at the discretion of the government to pay the salaries of governors, judges, and other colonial officials. Since the Townshend Acts threatened the precious power of the purse, colonial opposition was inevitable. The constitutional argument against these acts was best expressed by John Dickinson in his Letters from a Pennsylvania Farmer. Dickinson argued that even though a duty was external in nature, its legality was dependent upon its intent. If its primary purpose was to regulate trade, it was legal. But if its purpose was to raise revenue, it must be considered taxation without representation, therefore unconstitutional. Equally important as a part of the colonial resistance to Parliament was a circular letter adopted by the Massachusetts House. In drafting it, Samuel Adams maintained that since the British Constitution was fixed by the laws of nature and of God, neither Parliament nor the King could change it. The circular letter not only received the endorsement of other legislative assemblies, but it helped trigger a new set of non-importation agreements. Again, a colonial boycott prompted British merchants to exert pressure on Parliament. And again, Parliament responded by repealing the objectionable duties, except for the one on tea, which was retained simply to uphold the principle that Parliament had the right to tax the colonies. Here was a declaratory tax all over again. Amid the furor over the constitutional question of British taxation, the colonies had to deal with their own class divisions. The talk about no taxation without representation caused the unenfranchised and the underrepresented or unrepresented colonists to protest the rule of the privileged class in America. In all the colonies, the franchise was limited by property qualifications, and in some by religious qualifications as well. Since class distinctions existed throughout the colonies, the moderates were happy to end their quarrel with England, lest the lower class in America revolt against the status quo. In addition to the division of classes in colonial society, there existed a dangerous sectional cleavage. Wealthy merchants and aristocratic planters so dominated the colonial assemblies that the underrepresented farmers of the backcountry regions threatened to revolt. The frontier farmers were debtors and were at the mercy of the creditor class of the coastal regions in such matters as appropriations for roads, administration of justice, and taxation. This sectional cleavage was further aggravated by religious differences. As members of the dissenting churches, such as the Presbyterian and Baptist, they resented having to pay taxes to support the Eastern churches, including the Anglican Church. While these classes and sectional cleavages undoubtedly influenced the revolutionary movement, they hardly warrant our considering the revolutionary period primarily in terms of either class or religious conflict. Even before Parliament had taken final action in repealing the Townshend taxes, unexpected trouble broke out in Boston, where 7 British soldiers were provoked into firing upon a mob of 50 to 60 men and boys who were demonstrating the presence of British troops on the Commons. There was a place for them at out in the bay, but they kept them on the Commons as well as there. As a result, 5 Americans were killed in the encounter, including one Crispus Attucks, a Negro of French descent. I don't think we'd mention his name if we weren't in Indiana, but anticipating the round ball season next February, some of you might know where they got their name. Quick to make the most of this unfortunate event, the colonists called it the Boston Massacre. Although the word massacre was an obvious misnomer, the radicals used it to good advantage in playing upon the emotions of the people and in working up anti-British sentiment throughout the colonies. After the soldiers were tried in a Massachusetts court and given light sentences, good relations were temporarily restored. If Parliament had not made another blunder, further friction between England and her colonies might have been averted, or at least minimized. But Parliament did blunder. In a move designed to save the influential East India Tea Company from bankruptcy, Parliament voted a scheme to give the company a virtual monopoly on tea throughout the empire. Even though the tax on tea brought to the colonies was only 1/4 of that collected in England, the colonies still protested. By making it possible for the East India Tea Company to undersell the smugglers, the colonial merchants who profited from smuggling were understandably upset. While the merchants were objecting to the new measure on economic grounds, Samuel Adams and his radical friends took advantage of the opportunity to protest on political grounds the act. Furthermore, their protest took a form commensurate with their radical views. Whereas in Charleston, the tea was unloaded and stored in cellars and allowed to spoil, and in New York, tea-bearing ships were refused permission to unload, in Boston, the radicals cheerfully helped in the unloading process. Because they employed the unorthodox method of jettisoning the tea into the bay, however, punitive measures were invited. In meeting this new challenge, I don't know whether that's an attempt to harass me here or harass me. In meeting this new challenge, Parliament passed 4 coercive acts aimed at Massachusetts in general and Boston in particular. The colonists labeled these intolerable. At the same time, Parliament passed the Quebec Act, which extended the administration or the administrative boundaries of the province of Quebec to include much of the territory acquired from France 11 years earlier. Particularly objectionable to the colonists were those provisions which dealt with the toleration of Catholics and with civil trials without jury. Massachusetts, in a document known as the Suffolk Resolve, denounced the act as a menace not only to Protestantism but also to the civil rights and liberties of all America. Moreover, those interested in land speculation in the West regarded the act as a direct attempt to discourage migration to that region north of the Ohio River. Determined to exploit the widespread discontent over the passage of the coercive acts, the radicals appealed to all the colonies for concerted action. The appeal was carried by a newly created network of committees of correspondence. Upon getting the news, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed a resolution calling for a Continental Congress. The proposal was heartily received by the other colonies. As a result, the First Continental Congress began its deliberations on September 5th, 1775, in Philadelphia. Now, it was 74, with all the colonies except Georgia represented. Although the radicals were in a majority at this Congress, they barely defeated Galloway's compromise plan, which would have accorded the colonies considerable autonomy. Encouraged by this victory over the moderates, the radicals prevailed upon Congress to adopt a document entitled A Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which protested against taxation without representation. Professor Brinton, in his book, The Anatomy of Revolution, observes that while the slogan, taxation without representation, was capable of exciting the colonists, actually it was the government that was in financial difficulties, not colonial society itself. Another accomplishment of the Congress was the formation of a Continental Association, which was designed to boycott British goods. The acts of violence which enforced this boycott were as revolutionary in the eyes of England as the agreement which convened the Congress. Chances of averting an open conflict were increased when were not increased when the radicals urged that militia companies be formed and munitions of war be collected. Like previous boycotts on British goods, this one also had repercussions in England. Pitt, Burke, Berry, Wilkes, and incidentally those names Lord Berry and Charles Wilkes suggest the name of a Pennsylvania town, Wilkes-Barre, which was formed about this time, and other liberal political leaders, as well as some merchants, urged Parliament to make generous concessions to the colonies. But the ministry, backed by the king and the majority of Parliament, was in no mood to yield. Instead, it set its sights on stricter supervision of New England trade and authorized the sending of more troops to America. England was not alone in experiencing the divisive effects of these developments. In the colonies, the radicals used positive propaganda and efficient organization to obtain the support of the moderates. As the showdown neared, those who supported resistance to England became Whigs or patriots, while those conservatives who withstood the pressure of public opinion became Tories or loyalists. Eventually, many of those who persisted in the beliefs of the latter were forced to leave the colonies for reasons of health. With tensions mounting on both sides of the Atlantic, the actual outbreak of hostilities came as no surprise. On April 18, 1775, General Gage dispatched British troops to seize military supplies that the radicals had accumulated at Concord and to arrest Samuel Adams and John Hancock, two radical leaders. En route to Concord the British encountered a company of armed militia at Lexington. There a shot was fired. The Revolutionary War had begun. This brings us to the second phase of the Revolution. The popular notion that the American Revolution was confined to military activities is faulty on two counts. In the first place, it is far too restricted a view. It fails to recognize that the actual fighting represented only one phase of the struggle. Secondly, it is an inaccurate term. If we were to view the struggle solely from the military point of view, we might well adopt the suggestion of John Adams and call it the first war of the United States. Just imagine the traumatic effect that would have on the rank and file of the American people, to say nothing of the DAR. To trace such, and I might add, the DAR, incidentally, are having what convention is that, Miss Rose? They're having one in Philadelphia, I think, at this very moment. So, to trace each campaign of the Revolutionary War would be neither possible nor desirable for our purposes here tonight. Suffice it to mention only certain selected aspects. At the start of the war, both sides were in a quandary as what to do. Lord Howe, who early assumed command of the British forces in America, protested that he sympathized with the colonists in their quarrel with the king. But then he proceeded to accept the appointment as British commander and attempted to put down such opposition. Fortunately for the Americans, his contempt for the fighting ability of the colonial militia made the British overconfident. Also, his dilatory tactics enabled Washington to elude him upon several crucial occasions and thus keep the Continental Army intact. Even though the British had a greater reservoir of manpower, complete control of the seas, and relatively unlimited financial resources, they entered the war half-heartedly and were never able to realize their great potential against the widely scattered colonies. The Americans, too, were plagued by problems. In the first place, they were neither united nor enthusiastic about the war. Upon the outbreak of hostilities, the Loyalists not only refused aid to the Americans, but joined the British and fought against them. Enlistments were short-termed, sometimes for no longer than 3 months. Also, the absence of a sustained spirit of patriotism was all too apparent. To fight for independence was one thing. To fight for love of country was something quite different. The latter was an ideal which awaited the formation of a nation. Until then, state loyalties continued to take precedence over national unity, with the result that New Englanders were reluctant to fight in the South, and Southerners balked at fighting in New England. All the while, residents of the Middle States were reluctant to fight anywhere. Although individual acts of bravery were performed and courageous sacrifices were made, such as those at Valley Forge, outright desertion continued to be commonplace. While the Fabian tactics employed by Washington early in the war placed him among the great political leaders of all time, they offered small comfort to the American public at the time. Notwithstanding their overall effectiveness, the strategic retreats are rarely accepted by the civilian population as a substitute for brilliant victories on the battlefield. Obviously, the fighting in the American Revolutionary War was a far cry from the long series of glorious exploits depicted by the ultra-nationalists of a century ago. Such victories as Saratoga, Trenton, and Yorktown were decisive largely because they occurred at the right place and at the right time. Typical of the manner in which isolated battles have been glamorized by certain historians in the traditional account of the attack on Fort Ticonderoga in the war is this. Motivated by the need to acquire cannons as well as the desire to capture an important British fort, Ethan Allen and Benedict Arnold led a group of Americans in their capture of the strategic fort. In later years, when Allen was asked about details concerning their victory, he replied that he called upon the commandant, quote, "In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress, I demand your surrender," unquote. Since Allen was a known deist who admittedly had real doubts about the existence of the great Jehovah, and since he certainly held no commission from the Continental Congress, such an utterance struck some historians as highly unlikely. In fact, it appears so incongruous that one historian, Frederick Jackson Turner, investigated. On the basis of his extensive research, he concluded that what Allen really said was, quote, "Come out of there, you damned old rat," unquote. It is unfortunate that certain writers of the past have felt compelled to resort to obvious untruths in their attempts to embellish upon the events in history, when a truthful presentation of the facts would have done far more to pay tribute to the courageous sacrifices of our forefathers. Insofar as Allen is concerned, few will deny that he was courageous, powerful, and profane. I might just add here, in looking back over the 19th century historical accounts of this period, we can be very grateful. At least most of the more reputable ones avoided Parson Weems and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Two events occurred during the Revolutionary War which caused it to escalate from a family spat into an all-out war. The first involved the use of mercenaries by the British. When the Americans learned that Hessian soldiers had been hired to fight in America, they were simultaneously hurt and enraged. As a result, many patriots who earlier had questioned the wisdom of separation, including Washington himself, I might add, were convinced that now there was no alternative. The final impetus for independence came in 1776, when Thomas Paine, a recent arrival from England, published a pamphlet entitled Common Sense, in which he presented in logical and simple terms the case for separation. Ignoring Parliament, he ridiculed the idea of personal loyalty to the king and pointed out the economic advantages to be gained through a complete separation from England. His impassioned appeal caught the imagination of the American public and spread to Congress, which shortly thereafter adopted the Declaration of Independence. Henceforth, the Americans not only had a war to fight, but a goal to achieve. If the use of German troops aroused the ire of the Americans and influenced them in their decision to declare independence, the British became similarly aroused over developments about a year later. Following the surrender of General Burgoyne at Saratoga in 1777, Parliament made another attempt to conciliate the colonists by offering to meet all of their demands short of complete independence. As usual, the British were too late with too little. 11 days earlier, France had signed a treaty of alliance, agreeing to fight on the side of the United States until such time as England would recognize their independence. I might add here parenthetically that the famous English historian Creasy wrote a small volume which he entitled 12 Strategic Battles of the World. And it's rather interesting, although this book is about 75 years old now, that one of these 12 battles was the Battle of Saratoga. Of course, the English might have every reason to regard that as crucial. Now the shoe was on the other foot. Many British leaders who previously had been loath to annihilate their American brethren suddenly became deadly serious about prosecuting the war. But the hour was late, and England discovered that she could never recapture the many military opportunities she had passed up in the past. Early in the war, the Patriot Navy consisted of over 400 privateers, which were used to prey on British shipping. By the end of the war, they had sunk 2,000 ships, seized property worth over 18 million pounds, captured 12,000 sailors. Although at no time was there ever a confrontation between the American fleet and the mighty British fleet, the capture in British waters of the British warship the Serapis by John Paul Jones was a glorious achievement, rivaling the highest naval traditions of the British themselves. Certainly it helped morale. But following the Treaty of Alliance in 1778 with France, the Patriots increasingly relied upon the French Navy and allowed their own to dwindle into insignificance. Some fighting during the war was done on strictly a local or regional level. Such was the case with George Rogers Clark, who was authorized by the state of Virginia to conduct a campaign against the British and Indians in the Old Northwest. Although his campaign succeeded in taking the sting out of the Indian attacks upon the new settlements of Kentucky and Western Virginia, overzealous local historians have been inclined to exaggerate his exploits. Clark and his force of about 150 volunteers demonstrated great courage in their successful attacks upon several strategically located British forts on the frontier. But while such feats entitled them to considerable praise, they failed to support the popular notion that this Western campaign was largely responsible for England's generosity at the peace table. I might say that if you read Channing, he barely mentioned Clark. And it wasn't until 1937 that someone going through the archives in Paris came across the Rainevall Memorandum, and the Indiana Magazine of History published that, which showed that at least they knew about George Rogers Clark at the Peace Convention. For a long time, there was some question whether they even knew about it. But by the same token, as I point out, to ascribe our great concessions that England made to that event would be untruthful. Meanwhile, the Continental Army was entering the final phase of their struggle with British. Failing to win the war in the north, the British concentrated their attention on the south, from whence they hoped to roll up the colonies like a rug. After some initial successes, their southern campaign bogged down into a nip-and-tuck affair, which continued until the surrender of Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. This battle marked the end of fighting in America. Upon hearing the news of this surrender, Lord North probably expressed the feeling of most Englishmen when, with chagrin and relief, he exclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over." One of my colleagues suggested that you have to have humor, and I had to go to 1066 and all that, which is a humorous commentary on English history, to put in this rather questionable insert, in which Sellers and Yeatman point out that the war with the Americans is memorable as being the only war in which the English were ever defeated, and it was unfair because the Americans had the Allies on their side. And then he goes on to point out, though, that the tables were balanced a short time later when the Allies, including the United States, joined them in World War I. With the termination of hostilities, there remained the problem of negotiating a peace settlement. Again, circumstances favored the United States. This time, they lay in the diplomatic realm. Finding herself at war with France, Spain, Holland, to say nothing of the League of Armed Neutrality that Russia had formed, as well as the United States, British diplomats worked at driving a wedge in the diplomatic front opposing her, in hopes of getting her enemies to negotiate separately. Reasoning that this aim could be achieved by dealing with the ex-colonies first, she secretly negotiated an agreement with the American commissioners. The following year, this agreement was formalized in the Treaty of Paris. In addition to recognizing the independence of the United States, England made territorial cessions which exceeded all American expectations. Professor Bemis, the well-known diplomatic historian, seemed justified in calling this treaty the greatest diplomatic coup in American history. One cannot help but wish that some of the diplomatic skill so abundant in 1782 had been held in reserve to assist us in our current international dilemma. The final phase of the American Revolution was the period under the Articles of Confederation. Perhaps John Fiske overstated the case when he entitled his book dealing with the period "The Critical Years." Yet certain aspects of the Confederation were critical indeed. Adopted by the Continental Congress in 1777, but not ratified until 1781, as a wartime experience, it was aimed at achieving unity. But, of course, as pointed out, it wasn't ratified until 1781. By that time, the war was about over. It soon became apparent that the central government under the Articles could not efficiently perform its duties. Faced with the problems arising from inflation and economic dislocation, sexual jealousies, and frontier difficulties, the national government rated little respect. It was unfortunate that the Confederation period should coincide so closely with the economic depression which followed in the wake of our separation from England. But despite these disturbing elements of American society in the immediate post-war years, in some respects these years were creative. Not only were there notable advances in arts and letters and education, but in the political field as well. Certainly the Northwest Ordinance and the Federal Constitution stand out as political landmarks of the first order. If wartime Continental Congress can be considered to have been a head without a body, then Congress under the Articles may be thought of as a body without a head. All national legislative and judicial power was entrusted to a single assembly. Since amendment to the Articles required the unanimous consent of all states, chances for changes were slim indeed. Perhaps Fiske was thinking about the helplessness of Congress when he referred to these years as the critical years. In certain respects, the war with the mother country was the external revolution, while attempts to resolve domestic issues was the internal revolution. The inability of the federal government to solve the many issues which arose during the immediate post-war period eventually led to a change. Although the squabble between New York and New Jersey over tariffs was only one of several such interstate disputes, its settlement at a conference at Washington's estate in Mount Vernon in 1785 was so encouraging as to lead to another the following year at Annapolis, where tariff problems of the several states constituted the agenda. Since the absence of a quorum precluded positive actions there, a third meeting was held in Philadelphia in 1787, at which time the delegates began their deliberation with the intention of revising the Articles, but ended with the new Constitution. Meanwhile, an incident took place in Massachusetts that dramatically emphasized the need for a stronger central government. When the legislature of that state, which was controlled by the relatively prosperous commercial element, refused to meet the demands of the small farmers and other debtor groups who favored liberal paper money issues, bands of insurgents interfered with court sessions during the summer of 1786. Led by Daniel Shea, an insurgent army of some 2,000 forced the adjournment of a court in Springfield, Massachusetts. Although the militia, generously supported by the conservatives, put down the rebellion, the cleavage between the classes made a change inevitable. Like the later French Revolution, the Americans experienced their own Thermidorian reaction. The relaxation of war discipline, plus a renewed scramble for wealth, pointed to a reversal of current trends. Conservative property owners throughout the country became genuinely concerned over the strength of the agrarian and unpropertied classes. With such men as Hamilton, Madison, and Washington advocating a stronger central government, the languishing Congress complied and a new form of government was evolved. For over a century following the Constitutional Convention, the Founding Fathers were revered as wise and virtuous men who disregarded petty self-interest and concerned themselves with the welfare of all. Then early in the 20th century, scholars like J. Allen Smith and Charles Beard revised the traditional concepts concerning these men. According to these and other revisionists, the delegates to the convention were actually self-interested conservatives who had repudiated the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. Since Beard's provocative thesis was published during the economic depression of the 1930s, his manipulation of the facts was easily overlooked. Such startling revision invited challenge, and so it was. Today, the revisionists themselves are being revised by a new batch of scholars led by such men as Merrill Jensen, Robert Brown, and Forrest McDonald, to name only a few. Just how long the new views will prevail becomes a matter of conjecture. Yet the volume of historical literature has not only increased tremendously during the last 3 decades, but promises to continue at an accelerated rate in the future. I should like to think that a lecture of the magnitude we are considering, on the subject, the magnitude we are considering here tonight, might give rise to another question. What happened next? But alas, I know what you are really thinking. When do we go? In answer to this, I take my cue from an incident I observed about 20 years ago. It involved a formal reception for an ousted foreign dignitary who spoke only broken English. In the midst of a rather boring discussion, early in the evening, he jumped to his feet, clicked his heels, bowed, and exclaimed, "I go." Except for this final observation, I too say, I go. The more one studies the American Revolution, the more one realizes that it was a many splintered thing. If the past is any criterion, modern scholars undoubtedly will continue to inspect carefully each splinter and publish, one of my colleagues took that as a very low pun, and publish new theories based on their observations. Still, when all is said and done, the chances are good that the American Revolution, like other revolutions, will continue to mean different things to different people.